I don't really do keto anymore. I eat pretty close to the earth. I eat a wide variety of foods. I still eat pretty low carb, but the carbs that I am eating, I'm eating sweet potatoes, I'm eating fruit, maybe some honey, maybe some lentils. But that's it. I don't really go crazy on carbs, but I'm not strict keto anymore. Although I will phase in and out depending on what my goals are, because now it is a valuable tool in my toolbox. But when I look back at when I was doing keto for about a decade, even the times when I was very, very strict, there are some things that I would definitely do differently now, having a broader amount of knowledge and just being out of the specific keto world, so to speak, and being able to sit on the outside looking in. I can see where my shortcomings were and where things might have been different had I looked at these things that way prior. So the first thing that I would have done is I would have consumed way more protein, mainly more red meat. Okay, when I was doing keto, originally it started out as a very high fat, lower protein thing. Then the research started to come out more that, fat is not necessarily all that you want to get. You want to get more protein, and protein's not necessarily going to disrupt the ketogenic process. But now, the way I look at protein is protein should be staple and everything else kind of falls after that. Fats are great, but fats don't provide us with nearly as much nutrition as, say, like red meat would, right? So I look back at sort of the nutrient voids that I may have had, and I wonder how many of them could have been filled if I was just eating adequate amounts of red meat. Now, towards the end of when I was really strict keto, I was eating more protein, but I was still paying attention to the fats. The fats should have almost just come naturally with the meat that I was eating. And that's what I really would have done differently, first and foremost. The second thing I would have done differently, I would have put way more emphasis on potassium. I put so much emphasis on sodium because that's where a lot of the early literature was, okay, you lose sodium, potassium, magnesium when you're on a ketogenic diet. Well, okay, so that would make sense that we would want to prioritize sodium. And we do want to increase sodium, but potassium always took a back seat. And this is based on what I know now. In fact, I literally just interviewed Dr. Jacob Torres out of University of California, Santa Barbara. And he was talking to me about how we need about 3 to 4 times the amount of potassium than what we think. Like 3 to 4 to 1 ratio is what we should be, potassium to sodium. Yet here we are, not really getting in much potassium and getting in lots of sodium. So when you start to lose those minerals and you add more sodium in, you might further disrupt that ratio. So I very much so would be paying much more attention to my potassium intake, whether that's from meat, whether it's from greens, or even from supplemental form. The third thing that I would have done differently is, depending on what I was eating, I would have added a multivitamin into my diet. Because I realized that if I reverse engineer and look at the way my diet was a lot of times on keto, there was no way I was getting adequate nutrition in. I was just not. I would eat things like chicken breast, and then I would also add cheese to it. I would do heavy cream, and I'm looking at this, I'm like, there's not any colors to this. I wasn't, some days, not getting a lot of red meat. Point is that on the days that I wouldn't be getting maybe liver in or red meat in, I should have been probably adding a good multivitamin in. It just makes sense that way. Like, you don't need to take a multivitamin every day. You take it on the days when you're not getting adequate nutrition in. And there was lots of days when I would just eat basic chicken and cheese and maybe some macadamia nuts, like pure white bland foods. And I'm like, wow, there's like not a lot of nutrient density in there. All that I would have had to do was maybe eat an ounce of liver or 2 ounces of liver, or have some ground beef. Or if I didn't do that, take a multivitamin. Or heck, I should have even taken more in the way of like liver capsules or organ capsules, because that's almost nature's multivitamin in a way. So I put a link down below for the liver capsule that I used today. It's from a company called Bowmar Nutrition, who I've talked about on this channel a lot. It's my friend Josh Bowmar's company. Actually, what is unique about his liver capsules, just FYI, it is non-defatted liver. So it still has some of the fat in it, which is really important for like the vitamin A, which is fat soluble. And it's really important for the delivery of the fat soluble nutrients that are in liver. Liver is a multivitamin. Like, if I wasn't taking a multivitamin, I would eat liver. If I couldn't eat liver, I would at least just eat more beef, because I do consider beef to be a multivitamin. But liver has that wide profile of vitamin A and the various B vitamins, not to mention the selenium, the zinc, the heme iron, all that stuff that's really, really good. So it is a good multivitamin. And I kind of wish I'd been taking it throughout the whole time I was doing keto. I only added it in towards the end, and it made a big difference in how I felt as far as energy was concerned, as far as mental clarity. It made a big difference, even on the days when I wasn't eating much. I put a link down below for the Bowmar Nutrition liver capsules. They're unlike a lot of the other ones that are on the market, so you're gonna wanna check them out. So that link is in the top line of the description underneath this video. And even if you're not doing keto, it's a great multivitamin. It is a great thing to use in lieu of a multivitamin. That's a little bit more of a natural form, if you want to call it that. So link down below. This one is going to irritate some people and probably confuse some people. But number 4 is I would have controlled my saturated fat intake more. Hear me out on this. We know now, well, we did know then, but we were in kind of an echo chamber. If you look at a lot of the literature, saturated fat in abundance, in an overcaloric state, is definitely a contributor to insulin resistance as well. It's not just sugar, and it's not just saturated fat, but when you look at them individually in high amounts, they can cause a fatty liver. They can cause insulin resistance. And the big reason that I did keto in the first place was I was type 2 diabetic when I was very overweight. So when I try to fix that by just adding something that is also not exactly good for insulin resistance, when you look at the literature, I think I could have ended up a lot further along, a lot faster, if I had just focused on eating good quality meat and not tried to add extra saturated fat in. Because for a long period of time, I added extra butter, I added extra cheese, I added extra ghee because it tasted good and I could do it. And clearly it worked because I lost weight. But my health markers, my biomarkers didn't improve until I was long after I had lost the weight. So that's what's interesting. I dropped a lot of weight, and my health markers didn't really improve until I had made some changes to my diet and I was at that lower weight for a while. I think I could have accelerated that more by possibly leaning into more of the fats from meat versus adding just a lot of cheese and butter in, and leaning into even the leaner meats and adding the fats from maybe olive oil and avocados a little bit more than just the saturated fats. I am not anti-saturated fat. I just think we have to look at the full picture here. The literature does suggest that copious amounts of saturated fat, especially in a caloric surplus, can contribute to insulin resistance. Number 5, I wish I was less carb phobic around my workouts, because it got to a point where some of my workouts were feeling stale and stagnant. And that was a big driver for me to sometimes eat more, because I would think it was a calorie issue, or it would even send me into a mental funk because my workouts weren't good. And then I started realizing, actually, after my keto years, really, that I was able to consume a lot more in the way of carbohydrates than I thought I could without it impacting my ketone levels. So I realized, because even now, eating roughly 100 grams of carbs a day, I don't eat that much, maybe 100 to 120. A lot of times after a workout, I'm still making ketones. I'm registering ketones even at that amount. And it makes me realize that I was so active, and as I lost weight and got more active, I probably could have added more carbs into my diet, had some fuel for my workouts in a different way that maybe would have given me more anaerobic intensity, because I was able to train at such a way that I could maintain muscle just fine. I could even build a little muscle, but my workouts would fall flat about 10 or 15%. I realize now that I could have added carbs even intra-workout to give myself a little bump that I needed to get a little bit more out of my workout to maybe get the performance gains that I'm having now. Number 6, I would have gone a little easier on the Keto-Treats, but the interesting thing is not just because they were hyper-palatable things and I was eating too many calories of them, because I definitely was. Like, I even look at kind of pictures of me doing keto compared to now. Like, I was puffier, and a lot of it was closely tied with the kinds of keto snacks I was eating at that time. And Dr. Dom D'Agostino mentioned something to me when I was on Mark Bell's podcast a couple months ago. He mentioned, well, Thomas, why were you getting so many omega-6s in? Because I made a comment about I probably should have controlled my omega-6 intake. And he's like, Thomas, where were you getting omega-6s from? And I had to think about it, and I was like, oh, it was the processed keto food that I was eating, sunflower oils, things like that. Because Dom was like, hey, Thomas, outside of processed keto food, where would you even get a bunch of omega-6s unless you were eating ridiculous amounts of nuts, which you probably weren't. And I had to think about it, and I realized, wow, without the processed foods, there's not a lot of seed oils coming in on a ketogenic diet. Without the processed, unless you're eating a copious amount of nuts, if you're eating mac nuts and the occasional almond, you're not getting many seed oils. So I wish that I had looked at that a little differently and maybe had less of the processed food, because I think I would have felt a lot better. And there were clear times when I would eat very whole food keto that I did feel better. And I wish I just had the wherewithal to realize that from the outside in at that time. Number 7, I definitely wish I didn't fear insulin so much. That came from being an overweight person. I was afraid that any presence of insulin was going to make me fat. That insulin was pro-growth, and that meant pro-fat accumulation. And there is no denying that we have an insulin issue. Hyperinsulinemia is a very real thing. But I also needed to understand that once I had recalibrated and was healthy, insulin was good for my recovery. And I shouldn't have been afraid of it. I shouldn't have been afraid of protein spiking insulin. I shouldn't have been afraid of a few carbs occasionally having an insulin spike, because a spike is supposed to come down, and as long as you rise up and come back down and don't stay high, there's no problems. Another thing I would have done differently is I would have measured my insulin levels more. I would have gone to the lab and I would have gotten my insulin levels measured. So I didn't just guess that my insulin was high because I had some carbohydrates or because I ate XYZ. I would actually look at that insulin data more so that I knew where the trajectory was. Number 8 is I would have monitored my cortisol more closely, especially in the beginning, because there were periods of time where my testosterone levels stayed relatively decent, but I had no sex drive, and I was symptomatic of low testosterone. Nowadays, eating a more, I don't want to say more balanced, but it is more balanced with more carbohydrates and more just adequate nutrition coming in, plus more activity, my testosterone levels are a little bit lower than where they were on keto, but I'm less symptomatic. I have better libido, I have better drive, better motivation, effort feels good, right? Now, during keto, those things were there, but not the way they are now. But they were better than when I was overweight. So I went from overweight, feeling like complete garbage, to keto, feeling great, to now feeling way great. And it's not because keto's bad, it's because I did keto, got to the place I needed to be, and now I've been able to adopt different principles. But my point in saying all this is that I should have monitored my cortisol to DHEA ratios. It's something that Dr. Paul Saladino talks about a lot, because when your stress levels are high and your DHEA is low, that is a really bad indicator that the stress from a ketogenic diet is impacting your sex hormones. If my cortisol was low and my DHEA was higher, that would mean that I'm not in such a stress state that my body's able to produce these sex hormones and I would be able to function normally. So there's a lot more than we need to look at than just the simple marker of testosterone. And number 9, I would have marched to the beat of my own drum more. I followed so much of the keto research that I didn't find what really worked for me until the end. And the end came, it landed on what is more like what I'm doing today, which is low carb, generally putting me into a ketogenic state if I'm fasting or if I'm working out, but otherwise I'm out of that ketogenic state. It's almost more, dare I say, ancestrally accurate, because I'm not in ketosis all the time, but if I go a period of time without eating, I do snap into ketosis really quick because I'm not totally gorged on fuel and carbs all the time. So it's something that I've learned that just because the literature says you need to do this doesn't mean you do it. You do what works for you and what optimizes you. And you have to tinker and you have to try different things to find what works for you specifically. As always, I'll see you tomorrow.